Tonight, we're diving into the surprisingly complex world of medieval hygiene, from bathhouses to bone combs, and how people fought filth long before modern plumbing. Like, subscribe, and let's uncover the dirt on staying clean in the Middle Ages. The popular image of medieval Europe is often grim: filthy streets, squalid living conditions, and people who rarely bathed. But like many things from the past, the truth is more complex than the myth. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was a story of contrasts between town and country, rich and poor, custom and necessity. While there were certainly dark, disease-ridden corners of medieval life, many people understood the importance of cleanliness, even if their understanding differed from ours. In the early Middle Ages, particularly during the decline of the Roman Empire, public sanitation systems like aqueducts and sewers fell into disrepair. The grandeur of Roman baths faded into memory, and the infrastructure that once carried clean water to cities and waste away from them vanished in many parts of Europe. But the idea of washing, of being physically clean, did not disappear. Rather, it adapted. In monasteries, especially those following the rule of Saint Benedict, cleanliness was seen as a sign of godliness. Monks were expected to wash their hands before meals, shave regularly, and bathe at least a few times a year, as a form of discipline and humility. Outside monastic walls, hygiene was more inconsistent. In rural areas, peasants often bathed in rivers or streams, especially during warmer months. For them, water was a common feature of daily life, used for cooking, brewing, laundering, and washing. That said, their access to clean water varied greatly depending on geography and season. When winter froze rivers solid or droughts dried them up, personal hygiene understandably suffered. City life posed different challenges. Medieval towns were often crowded and poorly planned, with narrow alleys, open sewers, and livestock sharing space with humans. Waste disposal was a recurring problem. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets or nearby ditches, sometimes without warning, leading to the infamous cry, "Gardelu," in parts of northern Europe, a signal for pedestrians to watch out for falling waste from above. Rain might wash away the filth, but during dry spells, the stench of refuse lingered thick in the air. Yet even in cities, people sought ways to stay clean. Public bathhouses, often influenced by surviving Roman traditions, continued to operate in many regions, especially in the earlier part of the Middle Ages. These bathhouses, called stews in England, were popular gathering places. People paid for access to tubs of warm water, sometimes sharing space with others in a steamy communal environment. In addition to washing, these places offered massages, social interaction, and, increasingly toward the later medieval period, illicit services, which caused the church and civic authorities to periodically shut them down or regulate them more heavily. Soap, though rougher than today's perfume bars, was widely used. Made from animal fats mixed with lye, it was harsh but functional. Regions like Castile and Spain even produced high-quality soap that became a valued trade item. In Northern Europe, particularly among the Norse and Germanic peoples, grooming tools such as combs and tweezers were found in many graves, a sign that personal care was culturally significant. Medieval medicine also influenced views on hygiene. The prevailing theory of health, rooted in humoral balance, held that cleanliness could impact one's internal equilibrium. Washing the face in the morning, combing the hair to stimulate the scalp, and cleaning the hands before meals were all considered good practices. Physicians advised washing as a way to open the pores, releasing harmful humors. But excessive bathing was sometimes discouraged, particularly in the colder months, when open pores were thought to invite disease into the body. Medieval people may not have understood bacteria or germ theory, but they had a nuanced, if sometimes flawed, framework for personal cleanliness. Far from universally filthy, the Middle Ages held within them a spectrum of hygiene practices, shaped by geography, social class, religious teaching, and medical belief. By the High Middle Ages, bathing had evolved into a surprisingly elaborate ritual in many parts of Europe. Despite the myth that people never bathed, records from towns like Paris, London, and Prague show a thriving bathhouse culture. Wooden bathhouses, often situated near rivers or wells, became part of urban life. They were places not only for cleaning the body, but also for relaxation, healing, and even matchmaking. The experience of visiting a bathhouse could last several hours. Patrons would first undress and sit in a warm room to sweat, similar to a sauna. Then they might soak in hot water, be scrubbed by attendants, and finally be massaged with oils or perfumed waters. In wealthier cities, bathhouses were equipped with separate tubs for different water temperatures, hot, warm, and cold, a luxury few could afford at home. However, the line between hygiene and vice blurred over time. As bathhouses gained popularity, they also became associated with sexual activity. By the 14th century, many gained reputations as brothels, especially in cities where moral oversight was weak or corrupt. The church, increasingly concerned about moral decay, condemned bathhouses as dens of sin. In some regions, reformers sought to close them down entirely, while others simply enforced rules to separate the sexes or limit operating hours. Then came the Black Death. The plague of the mid-14th century devastated Europe, and with it came new fears about bathing. Many physicians, desperate to explain the spread of disease, warned against opening the pores through hot baths. According to contemporary medical theory, the skin acted as a barrier against bad air or miasma believed to carry illness. A warm bath that softened and opened the skin, they reasoned, made the body more vulnerable. Suddenly, what had once been seen as a healthy ritual became a suspected cause of death. In response, some people reduced bathing or stopped altogether. Layers of clothing and perfumes replaced water and soap. The nobility, in particular, leaned on fragrance to mask bodily odors. Lavender, rosewater, and vinegar-soaked cloths were common. Wealthy women carried pomanders, small, ornate balls filled with herbs and spices to ward off foul smells and, they hoped, disease. These were held to the nose in crowded streets or hung around the neck like medieval air fresheners. Yet even as fear of bathing spread, not everyone abandoned cleanliness. In Islamic Spain and parts of southern Europe, public baths continued to flourish. The Islamic world had long emphasized ritual cleanliness, and their influence on the Iberian Peninsula brought with it refined techniques for heating water, building steam rooms, and even creating elaborate drainage systems. Bathhouses in cities like Córdoba or Granada rivaled Roman designs and elegance. Medieval hygiene also extended beyond the body. Clothing, for instance, was often washed far more frequently than assumed. While outer garments like cloaks or tunics might be brushed and aired rather than soaked, underclothes were laundered regularly, sometimes weekly, depending on the household. Women played a key role in this, managing laundry as part of their domestic duties, using wood ash or lye soap and washing garments in rivers, tubs, or stone basins. The war on bad smells shaped many habits. Rushes and herbs were spread on floors to mask odors. Streets were swept, albeit irregularly, and laws in some towns prohibited the dumping of waste near wells or markets. But without a modern sewage system, filth was always nearby, and people did what they could to manage it. By now, the connection between health and hygiene was clear to many, even if their understanding of disease was incomplete. The next great leap in hygiene would come not from theory, but from the lived experience of those who survived plague, war, and filth, and still clung to the idea that clean living mattered. Despite the hardships of medieval life, people developed surprisingly detailed daily hygiene routines. While these rituals might seem minimal or even crude by modern standards, they reflected a genuine effort to stay clean in a world full of mud, manure, and disease. For most medieval Europeans, mornings began with the washing of the face and hands. Water would be poured from a jug into a basin, often made of metal, wood, or pottery. Soap was available, though its harshness varied. Some households used a homemade mixture of ash, animal fat, and herbs, while wealthier families might purchase imported soap from Castile, Aleppo, or Marseille. Combs were used daily to remove lice and dirt. These were often carved from bone, wood, or antler and had fine teeth. A combing routine wasn't just for grooming. It was part of a ritual believed to improve health by stimulating the scalp and relieving tension. Hair itself was washed less frequently, as drying it took time and could chill the body, especially in colder regions. Instead, people used scented oils or powdered herbs to clean and perfume their hair. Teeth were another area of concern. Contrary to the myth that medieval people paid no attention to oral hygiene, many took steps to protect their mouths. They used chew sticks, cloths, and even early toothbrushes fashioned from wood and bristle to clean their teeth. Recipes for mouthwashes survive in medieval manuscripts, often involving herbs like sage, mint, or rosemary boiled in vinegar or wine. Some recommended rubbing crushed salt, charcoal, or ground sage leaves on the teeth to keep them white and the breath fresh. Hands and nails received constant attention, especially before meals. It was customary to wash hands at the table before eating and often again after. Lords and their households would be offered warm water in metal basins by servants, sometimes accompanied by scented towels. This wasn't merely a courtesy, it was an ingrained social practice. Unwashed hands were seen as disrespectful, especially among the upper classes. Women had their own specific hygiene routines. Menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth required unique practices. Linen cloths, changed regularly, were used as menstrual pads. Midwives and healers often recommended warm herbal baths after childbirth to promote healing. Instructions for vaginal douching, using vinegar or wine infused with herbs, appear in medical texts. While the methods may seem outdated or even dangerous today, they reflected a serious effort to manage reproductive health within the knowledge of the time. Body odor was a recurring issue in a world without deodorant. In response, people created their own methods. Perfumed sachets were worn inside clothing, filled with lavender, clove, or rosemary. Some people applied a mixture of crushed herbs and animal fat to their armpits. Others carried handkerchiefs scented with oils to mask their own and others' unpleasant smells. Cleanliness extended into clothing. Though heavy outerwear like woolen cloaks was not frequently washed, undergarments such as linen shirts and chemises were laundered regularly. The linen absorbed sweat and oils, keeping the outer garments cleaner. Households, especially those of the middle or upper class, had dedicated wash days, and washerwomen were a common sight in larger towns. Clothes were scrubbed, beaten, soaked in lye or wood ash solution, and laid out to dry in the sun, which naturally bleached and disinfected them. Latrines and toilets varied widely by class. The wealthy had wooden seats with chutes that dropped waste into cesspits or moats. In castles, garderobes were built into exterior walls, allowing waste to fall away from living spaces. Poorer homes relied on chamber pots, emptied in backyards or into the streets, often causing tensions between neighbors and contributing to the spread of disease. Despite the limitations of their time, medieval people were not passive victims of filth. They adapted, improvised, and developed customs that prioritized cleanliness, even when the tools were crude and the risks high. Cleanliness wasn't just about vanity, it was a matter of dignity, ritual, and survival. In the Middle Ages, religion shaped nearly every aspect of life, and hygiene was no exception. Monasteries, abbeys, and convents weren't just places of prayer. They were among the cleanest institutions in medieval Europe. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by countless monastic communities, contained clear expectations for bodily cleanliness and modest self-care. Monks were expected to wash their hands before meals, bathe occasionally, and keep their bedding and clothing clean. These weren't indulgences, but spiritual practices tied to discipline, humility, and order. In some monasteries, communal bathhouses existed for this purpose. Monks might bathe once a week, or at least on key religious feast days. They shared towels, water basins, and grooming tools. Infirmaries inside the monasteries also offered warm water baths to the sick, the elderly, and visiting pilgrims, often scented with herbs like thyme or sage. Hygiene in these religious settings wasn't merely about personal health. It was a way to reflect divine order. Cleanliness was associated with purity of the soul. Dirty hands or an unwashed body before entering a chapel or touching sacred objects was considered inappropriate. This reverence for bodily cleanliness spilled into lay society. Towns built around monasteries sometimes benefited from access to cleaner water systems or the influence of monastic hygiene practices. Priests and clergy often preached about inner and outer purity, and Christian rituals such as baptism emphasized the symbolic power of water to cleanse and renew. Holy wells and springs, many repurposed from earlier pagan traditions, became sites of both spiritual and physical healing. Pilgrims would travel great distances to bathe in these waters, hoping to cure skin diseases, joint pain, or even leprosy. However, the religious perspective on hygiene was not always straightforward. While cleanliness was admired, excessive attention to the body could also be viewed as vanity or pride. Some saints and hermits were venerated for their filthy clothing and refusal to bathe, believing physical discomfort brought them closer to God. St. Thomas Becket reportedly wore a hair shirt beneath his fine robes, an intentionally scratchy garment used for penance. St. Godric, a hermit, refused to change his clothes or wash for decades, believing that suffering purified the soul. These extremes were the exception, not the rule, but they reveal how medieval thought blended hygiene with spirituality. Suffering could be sanctifying, while cleanliness could be an act of humility, or, depending on the context, a dangerous temptation toward worldly pleasure. Religious orders also contributed to the preservation of medical and scientific knowledge about cleanliness. Monks copied ancient Roman and Greek medical texts, including works by Galen and Hippocrates, which linked hygiene to health. These texts formed the backbone of medieval medical theory and informed practices from bloodletting to bathing. Even hospitals in medieval Europe, often run by religious orders, included spaces for washing patients and laundering linens. The Knights Hospitaller in Jerusalem, for example, maintained a large hospital complex with systems for bathing and waste disposal, reflecting both their military discipline and religious duty. Interestingly, Islamic influence also played a key role in advancing hygiene in Christian Europe. Through contact with the Muslim world during the Crusades and trade with Islamic Spain, Europeans encountered advanced practices in cleanliness, public sanitation, and bathing. In Islamic culture, ritual washing before prayer, called wudu, was mandatory. This routine, along with widespread use of perfumed soaps, advanced plumbing systems, and urban bathhouses, left a strong impression on European travelers and scholars. Religion, in all its complexity, thus functioned as both a motivator and inhibitor of hygiene. It could inspire order, discipline, and public health, or foster ascetic extremes that rejected the body altogether. Yet on balance, religious institutions laid the groundwork for organized sanitation and care centuries before public health became a science. By the late Middle Ages, European hygiene stood at a crossroads. The lessons learned from centuries of trial, tradition, and tragedy shaped how people approached cleanliness, both in body and environment. While misconceptions about disease still abounded, and sanitation was far from modern, the groundwork had been laid for significant change. The 14th and 15th centuries were marked by catastrophe. The Black Death had torn through Europe, killing millions. Recurrent outbreaks of plague and other diseases forced cities to reconsider their relationship with dirt and waste. In response, many towns began implementing rudimentary public health measures. Waste collection became more formalized. Some cities hired rakers or scavengers to clear streets of manure and refuse. Regulations were passed banning the dumping of waste near wells, marketplaces, or churches. Fines were issued for households that allowed foul water to accumulate near their doors. Architecture also began to adapt. Privies, primitive toilets, were increasingly built with more thought, often placed over flowing water or cesspits that could be emptied. In larger towns, stone conduits carried water from nearby springs into public fountains and wells. Though not filtered by modern standards, this running water reduced reliance on stagnant sources. At the same time, a growing merchant class, especially in Italy and Flanders, began to display its wealth through cleanliness and personal grooming. Illustrated manuscripts from the period show women bathing in ornate tubs, servants pouring warm water from polished pitchers, and elegant homes equipped with washstands, towels, and basins. Personal hygiene was becoming a marker of civility and status. The use of soap became more widespread, too. Castile soap, made from olive oil, became a prized commodity, while northern European regions continued to rely on animal fat-based varieties. Soaps were often perfumed and shaped into decorative forms, particularly for noble households. They were traded, gifted, and even included in dowries. Meanwhile, the printing press revolutionized the spread of information, including advice on health and hygiene. Simple medical manuals and household guides, often translated from Latin into vernacular languages, offered tips on everything from treating head lice to keeping linen fresh. Though these texts mixed folklore with fact, they encouraged a more systematic approach to cleanliness. Cultural attitudes toward bathing remained complex. In some places, the association of bathhouses with immorality led to closures, especially in Protestant regions. But in others, particularly in southern Europe and areas influenced by Islamic practices, communal bathing continued well into the Renaissance. For example, in Hungary and the Balkans, Turkish-style baths were still in use long after their decline in northern cities. One area where hygiene lagged behind was in medical practice. Barber surgeons and physicians rarely washed their hands between patients, and surgical tools were only occasionally cleaned. This wouldn't change until well after the Middle Ages, with the advent of germ theory in the 19th century. Nevertheless, some hospitals run by religious orders maintain surprisingly high standards of cleanliness, regularly changing linens and providing patients with warm water for washing. By the end of the medieval period, a shift was underway, one that blended tradition with innovation. Cleanliness was no longer seen solely as a spiritual matter, but as part of a healthy, civilized life. This shift was slow and uneven, but it marked the beginning of a new relationship between people, water, and the world around them. The story of hygiene in the Middle Ages is not one of filth and ignorance, as is often portrayed, but of adaptation, resilience, and emerging awareness. In castles and cottages, monasteries and marketplaces, people sought ways to stay clean, not just to survive, but to live with dignity in a world that often made that difficult.